Most people boarded Flight 482 without noticing the woman in seat 12C, and that was exactly how Major Evelyn Brooks preferred it. At 39 years old, the retired U.S. Air Force pilot had spent nearly 2 decades making life-and-death decisions thousands of feet above the ground. Yet she had never been comfortable with attention. Dressed in a simple gray sweater, faded blue jeans, and well-worn sneakers, she looked more like a schoolteacher than someone who had commanded massive military aircraft through combat zones and humanitarian rescue missions. Resting beneath the seat in front of her was a faded canvas backpack containing only a novel, a small notebook, and a carefully protected photograph of her late father in his Air Force uniform, the man who had inspired her to fly. She was traveling home to Seattle after quietly visiting his grave in Texas, keeping a promise she had made every year since his passing. Retirement hadn't been easy. After leaving the military, Evelyn chose to teach aviation safety instead of chasing prestige, believing that preventing accidents was far more meaningful than collecting medals. She carried herself with quiet confidence, spoke softly, and treated everyone she met with respect because years in uniform had taught her that dignity should never depend on rank. Around her, the aircraft filled with ordinary life. A young couple laughed as they planned their honeymoon. A father patiently helped his daughter buckle her seatbelt, and an elderly woman nervously clutched the armrest before takeoff. Evelyn smiled warmly and leaned over to reassure her. "The first few minutes are usually the hardest," she said gently. "After that, it gets much easier." The woman smiled back, her shoulders relaxing. It was a small act of kindness that no one else seemed to notice. As the cabin doors closed, Evelyn looked out the window and quietly whispered the words her father had repeated before every flight. "Respect the sky, and it will respect you." She had no idea those words would carry a completely different meaning before the day was over. She believed she was just another anonymous passenger on another routine flight. Within the next hour, she would discover how quickly strangers could judge someone they knew nothing about, and how one unexpected question from the cockpit would change every life on board. Before we continue, if you enjoy powerful stories about courage, justice, and ordinary people revealing extraordinary character, you're in the right place. Welcome to EchoStory. Now fasten your seatbelt, because Flight 482 is about to become a journey. No one on board will ever forget Dot as passengers settled into their seats. Senior Flight Attendant Melissa Grant, 44, moved confidently through the aisle with the polished professionalism of someone who had worked commercial flights for nearly 20 years. Tall, impeccably groomed, and known for her flawless service record, Melissa had earned a reputation for keeping flights running efficiently. But behind that polished image was another reputation that only junior crew members whispered about. She had an unsettling habit of deciding, within seconds of meeting a passenger, who deserved patience and who didn't. Business class executives received warm smiles. Frequent flyers were treated like valued guests. Elderly travelers, first-time flyers, or anyone who appeared unsure of themselves often received a colder version of Melissa 1, wrapped in perfect customer service language, but sharp enough to make people feel small. Several junior flight attendants had quietly complained about her attitude over the years. Yet management had always dismissed those concerns as differences in communication style. Her performance numbers were excellent, and without clear evidence, no one had challenged her authority. As Melissa reached seat 12C, she noticed Evelyn's faded canvas backpack resting slightly beneath the seat ahead. It wasn't blocking the aisle or violating any safety rule, but Melissa stopped anyway. "Ma'am," she said with a tight smile that never reached her eyes, "some passengers think the rules are optional. Please place your bag exactly where it belongs." Evelyn immediately slid the bag another inch forward and nodded politely. "Of course. Thank you for letting me know." Most crew members would have continued walking. Melissa didn't. She glanced at the worn backpack, then at Evelyn's simple clothes, and made a quiet assumption. People watch a few aviation videos online, she said with a faint laugh, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. And suddenly, they think they know how airplanes work. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable looks. The remark wasn't openly insulting, but its target was obvious. Evelyn looked up, surprised, and simply smiled. "I've learned there's always something new to learn," she replied calmly. Melissa gave a dismissive nod. "I'm sure." She walked away, convinced she had put another difficult passenger in her place. From the rear galley, Junior Flight Attendant Sofia Ramirez, 26, had witnessed the entire exchange. She had worked under Melissa for less than a year and had seen similar moments before: small comments, subtle humiliation, quiet assumptions that left passengers embarrassed without giving them anything obvious enough to complain about. Sophia had once asked another senior crew member why no one reported Melissa's behavior. The answer had stayed with her ever since. She never crosses the line far enough for anyone to stop her. Sophia watched Evelyn return to looking out the window, saying nothing, defending herself to no one. There was a quiet dignity about her that made Melissa's behavior feel even more unfair. Sophia couldn't explain why, but something told her this passenger wasn't ordinary. And before Flight 482 reached cruising altitude, Melissa Grant would discover that the greatest mistakes are often made the moment we believe we already know who someone is. 45 minutes after takeoff, Flight 482 was cruising smoothly above the Rocky Mountains, when the cabin lights flickered once, then again. A few passengers looked up in confusion before returning to their conversations. Moments later, the aircraft shuddered as it entered an unexpected pocket of severe turbulence. Overhead bins rattled, coffee splashed across tray tables, and the seatbelt sign illuminated with its familiar chime. Captain Daniel Hayes' calm voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered an area of unexpected weather. Please return to your seats immediately and keep your seatbelts fastened." His reassuring tone eased some of the tension. But inside the cockpit, the situation was becoming far more complicated than the passengers realized. A partial electrical malfunction had caused one of the primary navigation displays to freeze while weather. Radar information became inconsistent. The first officer continued flying the aircraft safely using backup instruments, while Captain Hayes worked through emergency checklists with air traffic control. The airplane remained fully controllable, but the crew's workload had increased dramatically. Every decision now required extra verification, and every minute mattered. Back in the cabin, Senior Flight Attendant Melissa Grant instructed everyone to remain seated while the other crew members secured the service carts. As she walked past seat 12C, she noticed Evelyn calmly studying the emergency information card instead of showing panic like many other passengers. Melissa stopped and smirked. "Planning to help us fly the airplane?" she asked loudly enough for several nearby rows to hear. A few nervous passengers forced awkward smiles, unsure whether it was meant as a joke. Evelyn looked up with complete composure. "No," she answered gently. "I just believe it's always wise to understand emergency procedures." Melissa gave a sarcastic laugh. "Confidence is one thing, ma'am. Pretending to be an expert is another." The remark made the surrounding passengers visibly uncomfortable. Evelyn didn't respond. She quietly folded the safety card, placed it back into the seat pocket, and looked out the window again. Her silence spoke louder than any argument could have. Across the aisle, Junior Flight Attendant Sofia Ramirez witnessed the entire exchange. She could see passengers exchanging uneasy glances. The businessman in row 11 discreetly started recording on his phone after hearing Melissa's comment. Behind him, a young woman traveling with her mother also began filming. Sensing that something about the interaction didn't feel right. A father seated near the aisle captured another angle as Melissa walked away, shaking her head, believing she had just dealt with another attention-seeking passenger. Melissa opened the airline's electronic cabin log on her company tablet and entered a brief note stating that passenger 12C appeared anxious, questioned cabin procedures, and was creating unnecessary concern among nearby passengers. Sophia's heart sank. She had been standing only a few feet away. None of that had happened. Before she could decide whether to speak up, another violent jolt shook the aircraft, sending gasps through the cabin. At the same instant, the cockpit warning system sounded again. Captain Hayes looked at the updated weather display, exchanged a serious glance with First Officer Mark Collins, and reached for the interphone. After listening for only a few seconds, Melissa's expression changed completely. She slowly picked up the public address handset. The entire cabin fell silent as passengers heard the captain's voice echo through the aircraft. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a qualified military pilot on board, please identify yourself to a member of the cabin crew immediately. For the first time since boarding, every eye in the cabin turned toward one another, wondering if the person who could help save their flight was sitting quietly among them all along. For several long seconds, the cabin remained completely silent. Passengers glanced at one another, expecting someone in a military uniform to stand. No one moved. Then, from seat 12C, Evelyn Brooks quietly unbuckled her seatbelt and rose to her feet. There was no urgency in her movements, no attempt to impress anyone. She simply waited for the turbulence to ease before speaking in a calm, steady voice. "My name is Major Evelyn Brooks," she said. "I'm a retired United States Air Force pilot. I flew C-17 Globemaster aircraft for 17 years and now teach aviation safety. If the captain believes my experience could be useful, I'm available to assist in any way that's appropriate." The surrounding passengers stared at her in surprise. The same quiet woman who had spent the entire flight avoiding attention suddenly carried herself with the unmistakable confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime making critical decisions under pressure. Melissa Grant looked at Evelyn for only a moment before letting out a skeptical laugh. "Please sit down, Mom," she said, folding her arms. "The captain asked for a qualified military pilot, not someone who wants to feel important during an emergency." The words landed heavily across the cabin. A little girl looked at her father with confusion. "Daddy, why is she talking to her like that?" Her father had no answer. Evelyn didn't raise her voice or argue. Instead, she calmly reached into her faded backpack and removed a worn leather credential holder. Inside were her retired U.S. Air Force military identification card, her FIA, Airline Transport Pilot Certificate, and an instructor credential issued after her retirement. She held them out politely. "You're welcome to verify these," she said. Melissa barely glanced at the documents before pushing them gently back toward Evelyn. "People can print almost anything these days," she replied coldly. "Please return to your seat and stop creating unnecessary confusion." Several passengers gasped quietly. The businessman in row 11 continued recording without saying a word. The young woman across the aisle zoomed in on Evelyn's credentials, while a father seated 2 rows behind captured Melissa's refusal from another angle. 3 independent recordings were now preserving every second of the interaction. Junior Flight Attendant Sophia Ramirez, who had watched everything unfold, could no longer remain silent. Her heart raced as she stepped forward. "Melissa," she said respectfully but firmly, "our operations manual is very clear. If a passenger identifies themselves as having relevant emergency qualifications, we're required to notify the captain immediately. It's not our role to decide whether they're needed. That's the captain's decision." Melissa slowly turned toward Sophia, her expression hardening. "Are you questioning my judgment?" Sophia swallowed nervously, but refused to back down. "No, ma'am. I'm following airline procedure." The businessman in row 11 spoke up from his seat. "She's right. We all heard the captain's announcement." Another passenger added, "At least let the captain verify her credentials." For the first time that day, Melissa realized she was no longer controlling the situation. Every nearby passenger was watching. 3 different phones were recording. Even the other cabin crew members had fallen silent. With obvious reluctance, she picked up the interphone and contacted the cockpit. "Captain," she said, trying to sound composed, "we have a passenger claiming to be a retired military pilot." There was only a brief pause before Captain Daniel Hayes answered, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Don't evaluate her credentials yourself. Escort her to the cockpit immediately. I'll verify everything personally." Elisa's confidence disappeared. She quietly handed Evelyn her credentials back and stepped aside. As Evelyn walked toward the front of the aircraft, the entire cabin watched in complete silence. No one knew whether she would actually be able to help. But everyone now understood one thing. The woman they had barely noticed in seat 12C had just become the most important passenger on Flight 482. Captain Daniel Hayes unlocked the reinforced cockpit door just enough to safely receive Evelyn Brooks and examine her credentials without compromising cockpit security. The moment he read the name on her retired military identification, his expression changed. He looked back at her, then at the FAA Airline Transport Pilot Certificate in her hand. "Major Evelyn Brooks?" he asked quietly. "The same Evelyn Brooks who later taught advanced crew resource management at Maxwell Air Force Base?" Evelyn gave a modest nod. "Yes, Captain. But today I'm only here to help if you believe my experience is useful." Hayes immediately extended his hand. "Thank you for coming forward. Please understand, I'm not asking you to fly this aircraft. I remain in command. But we've lost part of our primary navigation display after an electrical fault, and my first officer and I are managing an unusually high workload while deviating around severe weather. An experienced military pilot can help us verify procedures and reduce cockpit workload." Evelyn answered without hesitation. "Understood, Captain? You'll make every decision. I'll simply provide another set of trained eyes." Within moments, she was seated in the jump seat, carefully reviewing the emergency checklist exactly as the captain instructed. As Captain Hayes coordinated with air traffic control, Evelyn noticed something unusual. One of the backup navigation pages showed a route update that didn't match the latest weather avoidance clearance. She waited until the captain finished transmitting before speaking. "Captain, may I point something out?" Hayes nodded. Evelyn calmly indicated the discrepancy. "The backup route appears to be displaying the previous waypoint sequence. It may not have synchronized after the electrical fault. Could we verify the latest clearance with center before entering the next weather cell?" Captain Hayes immediately requested confirmation. Seconds later, air traffic control confirmed Evelyn was correct. The aircraft's backup display had failed to refresh completely after the electrical malfunction. The correction prevented the crew from turning toward a far more severe area of turbulence. Captain Hayes glanced at Evelyn with genuine respect. "Excellent observation, Major." Evelyn smiled politely. "That's why cockpit teamwork exists, Captain." The aircraft remained completely under the captain's control, but the atmosphere inside the cockpit noticeably relaxed. The additional workload had finally become manageable. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, the balance of power had begun to shift. The businessman in row 11 quietly saved his video to cloud storage, so the original timestamp couldn't be questioned later. The young woman across the aisle emailed her recording to herself without posting it online, wanting the evidence preserved exactly as it happened. The father traveling with his daughter did the same. 3 independent recordings now documented Melissa Grant's sarcastic remarks, her refusal to examine Evelyn's credentials, and her attempt to dismiss the captain's request. Junior flight attendant Sofia Ramirez realized something even more troubling. While reviewing the electronic cabin log, she discovered that Melissa had edited her earlier report. The original entry stating that passenger 12C was merely anxious had now been expanded to claim Evelyn had questioned crew authority and disrupted cabin operations events that had never occurred. Knowing the importance of documentation, Sophia immediately captured time-stamped screenshots of both versions before any further changes could be made. She then quietly informed the lead purser, who locked the electronic cabin records and notified Captain Hayes through the secure crew communication system. Upon reading the message, the captain issued one clear instruction: preserve every report, every digital log, and every passenger statement exactly as it exists. Nothing gets changed. As Flight 482 finally left the worst of the storm behind, the cabin grew noticeably calmer. Passengers could feel the turbulence easing, but another realization was beginning to spread through the aircraft. This flight was no longer just about an in-flight emergency. It had become about truth, integrity, and whether one employee's misuse of authority had finally been witnessed by enough people to ensure it could never be hidden again. And while the aircraft continued safely toward Seattle, Captain Hayes quietly transmitted a priority message to airline operations, requesting executive-level representatives to meet the flight upon arrival. Without saying it aloud, everyone involved understood that the real investigation had already begun long before the wheels ever touched the runway dot inside the cockpit. The tension remained high, but there was no panic. Captain Daniel Hayes stayed firmly in command, while First Officer Mark Collins continued flying Flight 482, using the backup flight displays. Seated in the jump seat with the captain's authorization, Evelyn Brooks followed every instruction without overstepping her role. Years of military flying had taught her that discipline mattered most during an emergency. She wasn't there to take control, she was there to support the crew. As Captain Hayes coordinated a weather deviation with air traffic control, Evelyn quietly cross-checked the emergency checklist against the aircraft's backup navigation data. A few moments later, she noticed a subtle discrepancy. "Captain," she said calmly, waiting until he finished his radio transmission, "our secondary navigation page is still referencing the previous waypoint sequence. If a TC's latest clearance is changed, we may want to verify it before entering the next weather corridor." Hayes immediately requested confirmation from air traffic control. Seconds later, the controller responded that a revised routing had indeed been issued moments earlier. Because one of the aircraft systems had failed to update correctly after the electrical malfunction, the backup display was showing outdated information. Correcting the route kept the aircraft clear of a rapidly developing storm cell that pilots in the area had just begun reporting. Captain Hayes looked at Evelyn with genuine appreciation. "Excellent catch, Major Brooks." Evelyn simply nodded. "The credit belongs to the crew, Captain. I only noticed what you asked me to watch." It was exactly the kind of calm teamwork that professional aviators train for. And within minutes, the ride became noticeably smoother as Flight 482 left the worst turbulence behind. Back in the cabin, passengers immediately sensed that something had changed. The violent shaking had eased, conversations slowly resumed, and nervous faces relaxed. But attention quickly shifted back to Melissa Grant. Several passengers who had witnessed her behavior earlier quietly began comparing what they had recorded. The businessman in row 11 had already backed up his video to cloud storage. The young woman in row 13 preserved her recording without posting it online, believing the airline should first have an opportunity to review the evidence. The father traveling with his daughter saved his footage as well, capturing Melissa's refusal to even examine Evelyn's credentials. 3 independent videos from different angles now documented exactly what had happened. Junior flight attendant Sofia Ramirez also realized that Melissa had quietly edited the electronic cabin report after Evelyn entered the cockpit. Fortunately, Sofia had already saved time-stamped screenshots showing both versions of the report. She immediately informed the lead purser, who locked the cabin documentation system to prevent any further changes. "Everything stays exactly as it is," the purser said firmly. "If there has been a mistake, the investigation will determine the truth, not us." A few minutes later, Captain Hayes addressed the passengers over the public address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience and professionalism. We have successfully stabilized the situation and expect a safe arrival into Seattle. I'd also like to acknowledge a passenger whose aviation experience provided valuable assistance to our crew during a period of unusually high workload. While I cannot discuss operational details, I can say this: professionalism, humility, and teamwork made a real difference today." The cabin fell into respectful silence before quiet applause gradually spread through the aircraft. Evelyn lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. She had never stepped forward to be recognized. She had stepped forward because that was what years of service had taught her to do. Melissa remained standing near the forward galley, unable to meet the eyes of either the passengers or her fellow crew members. For the first time in her career, she realized that authority could no longer protect her from accountability. At that very moment, Captain Hayes sent one final operational message to airline headquarters requesting that senior executives, Flight Operations, Human Resources, and the Safety Review Board meet Flight 482 immediately upon arrival. After reading the captain's preliminary report, the airline's Vice President of Flight Operations responded with only one sentence: "Preserve every piece of evidence. We're handling this personally." As Seattle drew closer, everyone on board believed the emergency was over. They were wrong. The flight had been saved in the air, but the most important test of integrity was waiting on the ground. Flight 482 touched down safely in Seattle just after sunset. As the wheels met the runway, a quiet wave of relief spread through the cabin. There was no loud celebration this time, only exhausted smiles and grateful sighs. Captain Daniel Hayes taxied the aircraft to the gate before making one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience today. For operational reasons, we ask everyone to remain seated for a few additional minutes. Representatives from airline management will be boarding shortly." Curious glances filled the cabin. Passengers assumed it was routine paperwork following the emergency. Only the cockpit crew knew that this meeting was about far more than the electrical malfunction. Within minutes, Richard Lawson, the airline's Vice President of Flight Operations, stepped aboard alongside the Director of Safety, a Human Resources investigator, and a Legal Affairs representative. None of them looked rushed. They looked prepared. Captain Hayes greeted the executives before turning toward Evelyn. "Mr. Lawson," he said, "this is Major Evelyn Brooks, the passenger who assisted us during the emergency." Lawson immediately extended his hand. "Major Brooks, thank you for your professionalism today." Evelyn returned the handshake with her usual humility. "Captain Hayes and First Officer Collins brought this airplane home safely. I simply followed the captain's instructions." Lawson smiled respectfully. "That's exactly what the captain's report says." The executives then requested a brief review of everything that had happened before the emergency announcement. Melissa Grant confidently stepped forward, insisting she had merely followed procedure and that passenger 12C had behaved in a way she believed could distract the crew during a critical phase of flight. Before she could continue, Junior Flight Attendant Sofia Ramirez quietly raised her hand. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "That's not what happened. I witnessed the entire interaction. Major Brooks complied with every instruction immediately. The cabin report does not accurately describe what occurred. Melissa turned sharply toward her. Sophia. Think carefully before you contradict your senior crew member. Sophia took a slow breath. I already have. That's why I'm speaking. Richard Lawson looked at the investigators. Let's review the evidence before we reach any conclusions. One by one, the passengers who had recorded the incident voluntarily stepped forward. The businessman from row 11 handed over his original video file, complete with its untouched timestamp. The young woman from row 13 provided her recording from a different angle. The father traveling with his daughter submitted the third video, showing the interaction from behind Melissa. None of the recordings had been edited. When synchronized with the aircraft's cabin timeline, they created an unmistakable sequence of events. The investigators then opened the electronic cabin log. The system's audit history showed every change ever made to Melissa's report, including the moment she expanded her description after learning Evelyn's credentials were genuine. Nothing had been deleted. Nothing had been altered beyond recovery. The digital audit trail preserved the truth exactly as it had happened. The cabin grew noticeably quieter as the human resources investigator opened Melissa's personnel history. What had once appeared to be isolated complaints suddenly formed a troubling pattern. Over 6 years, multiple passengers and junior crew members had reported remarkably similar behavior: subtle public humiliation, selective enforcement of procedures, dismissive treatment of travelers she judged as unimportant, and incident reports that consistently favored her own version of events. Individually, each complaint had been considered too minor to justify serious action. Together, they revealed a culture that had ignored warning signs for far too long. Richard Lawson slowly closed the file and looked directly at Melissa. This investigation is no longer about a disagreement between a passenger and a flight attendant, he said calmly. It is about the integrity of our safety reporting system. When official records stop reflecting the truth, passenger safety is at risk. Lawson then turned toward Evelyn, who remained quietly standing near seat 12C. The cabin waited in complete silence. Major Brooks, he said, today you reminded every one of us of something our airline should never have forgotten. He paused before continuing. You deserved respect the moment you stepped onto this aircraft, not because you were a military pilot, not because you helped our crew, but because every passenger deserves dignity before anyone knows their story. No one applauded. No one spoke. The silence itself carried more weight than words ever could. Captain Hayes lowered his head in agreement, while Sophia felt tears welling in her eyes. Looking around the cabin, Lawson realized this flight had exposed something much bigger than one employee's mistake. It had revealed a system that had too often confused seniority with accountability. And as he instructed the legal department to begin a full company-wide review that very evening, everyone aboard Flight 482 understood that although the emergency in the sky had ended safely, the airline's most important journey toward earning back trust had only just begun. The investigation began before the last passenger had even left the aircraft. Airline security respectfully escorted Melissa Grant to a private interview room, while the remaining crew completed their post-flight responsibilities. Despite rumors already spreading through the terminal, Melissa was not dismissed immediately. Following company policy, she was placed on paid administrative leave pending a formal investigation. Richard Lawson made one thing clear to everyone involved. This airline doesn't punish people based on accusations, he said. We investigate facts. That's how we protect both our passengers and our employees. Every passenger who had recorded the incident was personally thanked for coming forward. Investigators explained that their videos would remain confidential and would only be used with their permission during the official review. The airline also requested the original, unedited files so the metadata and timestamps could be independently verified. By the following morning, Human Resources, Legal Affairs, Flight Operations, the Safety Review Board, and an independent aviation compliance consultant had formed a joint investigative panel. Their mission was simple: establish exactly what happened, why it happened, and whether the problem extended beyond a single flight. Over the next 2 weeks, every piece of evidence was carefully examined. Captain Daniel Hayes submitted his detailed cockpit report. First Officer Mark Collins confirmed every operational decision. And Sofia Ramirez gave a complete witness statement describing Melissa's conduct before and during the emergency. The 3 passenger videos were synchronized with the aircraft's communication logs, gate surveillance footage, and the electronic cabin reporting system. Together, they created a minute-by-minute timeline that matched almost perfectly. The investigation also confirmed that Melissa had edited her cabin report after Captain Hayes requested Evelyn's credentials be verified. The system's digital audit trail recorded every change, every timestamp, and every user action. Nothing could be erased. When investigators compared the edited report with Sophia's preserved screenshots, the differences became impossible to explain as simple mistakes. More troubling was what they found next. During a review of historical records, investigators uncovered multiple complaints dating back nearly 6 years. Elderly passengers had described being publicly embarrassed over minor issues. Junior crew members reported feeling pressured not to question Melissa's decisions. A disabled veteran recalled being spoken to as though I were an inconvenience instead of a customer. Each complaint had once appeared isolated. Seen together, they revealed a clear pattern that should have been recognized years earlier. When Melissa was interviewed for a second time, she admitted altering the wording of her report, but insisted she had done so only because she believed it better reflected the overall situation. The independent investigator responded calmly. Official safety documentation exists to record facts, not opinions. That single sentence changed the direction of the investigation. 2 weeks later, after reviewing all witness testimony, digital evidence, and company policies, the review board unanimously concluded that Melissa had violated multiple standards involving passenger dignity, professional conduct, and documentation integrity. Following due process, her employment with the airline was terminated. But the investigation did not end there. The board also determined that several supervisors had repeatedly overlooked behavioral complaints because Melissa's operational performance had always been rated highly. As a result, 3 managers received formal corrective action, while the airline ordered mandatory leadership retraining focused on recognizing behavioral patterns before they became safety risks. The report concluded with one powerful finding: operational excellence can never compensate for the loss of public trust. Sofia Ramirez was called into Richard Lawson's office a few days later, uncertain about her future. Instead of disciplinary action, Lawson handed her a handwritten letter. Most people stay silent when speaking the truth carries personal risk, he told her. You didn't. Enclosed with the letter was an invitation to join the airline's cabin safety and professional standards training team, where she would help teach future flight attendants that integrity is measured not by seniority, but by the courage to protect the truth. Captain Daniel Hayes later congratulated her personally. The emergency in the cockpit lasted less than an hour, he said. But what you did for this airline may protect passengers for years. As the investigation officially closed, everyone involved reached the same conclusion. The greatest danger on Flight 482 had not been the electrical malfunction or the storm outside the aircraft. It had been a culture that had quietly accepted small acts of disrespect until one ordinary passenger and a few brave witnesses finally made it impossible to ignore. In the weeks that followed, Flight 482 became a case study in aviation professionalism. But for Evelyn Brooks, the headlines never told the whole story. News outlets praised Captain Hayes for his leadership, recognized the airline's transparent investigation, and celebrated the retired military pilot whose experience had helped the crew during a difficult flight. Friends congratulated her, strangers thanked her, and veteran organizations invited her to speak about courage under pressure. She accepted almost none of the invitations. Instead, she returned quietly to her small home outside Seattle, where the loudest sound each evening was the ticking clock her father had once repaired with his own hands. Every morning she watered the flowers he had planted years before, brewed a cup of coffee, and tried to convince herself that life had returned to normal. But every time she packed a suitcase or heard the distant sound of an airplane overhead, memories of Flight 482 came rushing back. It wasn't the turbulence she remembered. It wasn't the cockpit. It wasn't even the emergency. It was the moment someone looked at her, decided she didn't matter, and treated her as though respect had to be earned instead of freely given. Several nights each week, Evelyn woke suddenly from vivid dreams. Sometimes she heard the warning chime from the cockpit. Other times she saw Melissa refusing to even look at her credentials. She found herself hesitating before booking another flight, something that had never happened during 17 years in the Air Force. At the suggestion of fellow veterans, she began meeting with a trauma counselor who specialized in helping first responders and military personnel transition after high-stress events. During one quiet session, the counselor asked a simple question. When you think about Flight 482, what hurts the most? Evelyn remained silent for nearly a minute before answering. The emergency in the cockpit lasted about 15 minutes, she whispered. The humiliation stayed with me for months. Tears filled her eyes as she looked down at her hands. I've spent my entire career protecting strangers, but for the first time in my life, I felt completely invisible. The counselor nodded gently. Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't caused by danger. They're caused by being made to feel that your humanity doesn't matter. Evelyn later wrote those words in her notebook, reading them whenever she questioned her own worth. Some bruises never appear on the skin, but they can take the longest to heal. Meanwhile, the airline completed its review with more than disciplinary action. Rather than issuing a generic public statement, Richard Lawson invited Evelyn to a private meeting attended by Captain Daniel Hayes, members of the Safety Review Board, and senior executives. Lawson placed a signed letter on the table before speaking. Major Brooks, he said quietly, this is not an apology because you were a military pilot. It is not an apology because you helped save a difficult situation. It is an apology because before anyone knew who you were, we failed to treat you with the dignity every passenger deserves. The room fell silent. Captain Hayes then spoke from the heart. I've flown for nearly 3 decades, he said. I've learned that the safest cockpits are built on trust. Today I learned that the safest airlines are built on respect. We should have protected your dignity long before we needed your experience. Evelyn accepted the letter with trembling hands. It didn't erase what had happened. It couldn't. But for the first time since Flight 482, she felt that someone truly understood the difference between recognition and respect. The investigation changed more than one life. Sofia Ramirez was promoted into the airline's Cabin Safety and Professional Standards Training Division, where she taught new flight attendants that integrity is measured by what you do when no one expects you to speak. Captain Hayes helped redesign crew resource management training, adding a new section titled Respect Before Recognition, reminding flight crews that assumptions can become safety risks. Across the airline, supervisors were instructed to identify behavioral patterns early instead of dismissing repeated complaints as isolated incidents. Months later, Evelyn began receiving handwritten letters from teachers, nurses, veterans, mechanics, and ordinary travelers who had seen news coverage of the case. Many shared stories of being underestimated because of their appearance, age, disability, profession, or quiet personality. Evelyn answered as many as she could. She ended nearly every reply with the same sentence. Never measure your worth by the opinions of people who never took the time to know your story. One peaceful evening, she placed her father's medals back into their wooden case, gently closed the lid, and smiled through quiet tears. She understood then that healing isn't the moment pain disappears. Healing begins the moment truth is finally seen, dignity is restored, and a wounded heart no longer has to carry its silence alone. Exactly 1 year after Flight 482, Seattle-Tacoma International Airport looked much the same, but inside the airline, everything had changed. Quietly and without a flashy advertising campaign, the company introduced a nationwide passenger care initiative called Respect Before Recognition. Every pilot, flight attendant, gate agent, and customer service employee completed mandatory annual training on respectful communication, documentation integrity, unconscious bias, conflict de-escalation, and ethical decision-making. More importantly, the airline implemented a new operational policy stating that any passenger identifying themselves as having relevant emergency qualifications would be treated respectfully and referred directly to the captain for verification without assumptions, ridicule, or delay. Another major reform required that all cabin reports be protected by an independent digital audit system, making every edit permanently visible to investigators. The new policy had one simple purpose. Truth should never depend on who writes the report. That same afternoon, Captain Daniel Hayes prepared for another routine flight to Seattle. As boarding began, he noticed a nervous elderly woman entering the aircraft with a cane while carrying a small insulated medical bag. Before she had a chance to struggle, a young flight attendant immediately walked over with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," she said gently. "Take your time. I'll help you with your bag, and if you need your medication during the flight, please let us know. We're here to help." There was no impatience, no judgment, no sarcastic remarks. Nearby, another crew member quietly informed the captain that the passenger carried emergency medication. Simply so, the crew would be prepared if assistance became necessary. Captain Hayes watched the interaction from the cockpit door and smiled to himself. This was exactly the airline they had hoped to become, not because of new policies, but because people had begun treating dignity as part of safety. Several rows back, another passenger quietly settled into seat 12C. It was Evelyn Brooks. The airline had invited her to observe the rollout of its new training program, but she had accepted only on one condition. She wanted to travel exactly like every other passenger. She boarded without ceremony, carrying the same faded canvas backpack that had been with her on Flight 482 a year earlier. The young flight attendant greeting passengers had never heard her story. "Good afternoon, Miss Brooks," she said warmly after checking the boarding pass. "Welcome aboard. If there's anything you need today, please don't hesitate to ask." Evelyn smiled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds, yet it meant more to her than every newspaper headline and television interview combined. For the first time, she wasn't being respected because she had once helped save a flight. She was being respected simply because she was another human being. That was the victory she had hoped for all along. As the aircraft climbed peacefully into the evening sky, Evelyn looked out of the window, resting one hand on the old photograph of her father inside her backpack. Softly, she repeated the words he had taught her before every flight. "Respect the sky, and it will respect you." Then she smiled and added words that had become her own. "Respect people, and they'll never have to prove they deserved it." The memory of Flight 482 would never completely disappear, but it no longer carried the same weight. It had become something different, a reminder that real courage isn't always found in traumatic rescues. Sometimes it's found in a junior employee who chooses honesty over fear. Sometimes it's found in passengers who refuse to look away. Sometimes it's found in a captain willing to admit that leadership begins with listening. And sometimes it's found in a quiet woman sitting in seat 12C, reminding the world that dignity should never have to be earned. It should be given freely from the very beginning. If this story touched your heart, comment, respect before recognition, because no one should ever have to prove their worth before being treated with kindness. If you believe every person deserves dignity from the very first moment, please like, share, and subscribe to EchoStory for more unforgettable stories of courage, accountability, hope, and emotional justice. Until our next story, remember this: the greatest heroes are often the ones no one notices until the moment character speaks louder than titles, uniforms, or recognition.